Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Naseem Ahmed and I will be your host. This week we are talking to Professor Mahmood Mamdani. Professor Mamdani is the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government. He received his PhD from Harvard University in 1974 and specializes in the study of colonialism, anti-colonialism, and decolonisation. Professor Mamdani's work explores the intersection between politics and culture, a comparative study of colonialism since 1452, the history of civil war and genocide in Africa, the Cold War, and the War on Terror. He has a number of works, and his latest is called Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, published by Harvard in 2020. It was shortlisted for the British Academy Book Prize for Global Cultural Understanding. Thank you for joining us, Professor Mamdani.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So today, based on your book, today we'll be exploring some of those ideas, including the historical and political forces that are shaping the current war, crisis in Gaza. And we'll be asking Professor Mamdani about his insights on concepts such as de-Zionisation and what that means. And to get us going, Professor Mamdani, I want to first ask you, drawing upon your extensive knowledge as a historian and a political theorist, how would you analyze the roots and dynamics of the ongoing atrocities in Gaza? In your view, what deeper historical political forces are at play beyond the surface level explanation and focus on what we've seen so far, individuals like Netanyahu, other simplistic narratives about Israel's security. There are, of course, as you cover in your books, other underlying forces that we must be taken into account if you are to really understand what we are seeing in Gaza at the moment.
Well, if you're looking for deep causes, I would suggest that one begin with the colonization of Palestine. Not just the colonization of Palestine by Britain, but towards the last part of British rule, a new kind of colonization by a proxy force, which could only colonize Palestine with the direct assistance of the imperial power. And this proxy force was Zionism. So you have a formal legal movement where you have declarations. You have the Balfour Declaration, where Britain declares that Palestine is a home for the Jews. And then you have the UN declarations towards the end of the Second World War, where the UN sanctions the partition of Palestine. There are all kinds of questions about the population of Palestine, the Jewish, the figures between the numbers of Jews and the numbers of Palestinians, because these are not of one religion. They are of several religions, and the territories assigned to the minority population of Jews, and much less territory assigned to the majority population of Palestinians. But that became secondary because the Zionist authorities had, I think now one can say almost from the outset, their larger ambition was to swallow the whole of Palestine, and began a sort of phased expulsion of Palestinians from their land, known as the Nakba, and beginning in sort of a major show of force and then interrupt it for some time. And most people see the current violence against extreme violence, murderous violence against Palestinians in Gaza as a continuation of the Nakba. So the basic cause is settler colonialism, which seeks the land of the colonized more than it seeks their labor.
We'll unpack some of that during this conversation. One of the key things in your work is to show how nation building has always been a genocidal project. Ideologically, if one embarks on nation building, genocide, ethnic cleansing is inevitable. A lot of times when we look at Israel-Palestine, we seem to forget that there's still an ongoing nation-building project in what was historic Palestine. And we forget to see the existing violence of the genocide that's taking place in Gaza now in the context of the wider nation-building project that began in 1947-48 in historic Palestine. The question I wanted to ask you is it always the case that genocide is always baked into every nation-building project? And at what point does genocide become inevitable?
Well, first I would caution us and suggest we not think of the nation building project as the underlying cause, but the project to build a nation state. It's the joining of the nation in the state, which is problematic. Nations can exist without states. Nations can think of different places as homes, and it still doesn't have to lead to this kind of outcome. So the nation-state project originates in a particular period. This is the period that follows the Crusades. It is the period where the Pope is directly organizing Christian nobles and getting them to actively participate in the Crusades on the promise that their sins will be forgiven. And the larger project is the creation of a state of Christians. The nation-state project, broadly speaking, has two phases, and I think we need to distinguish the phases from one another. The opening phase is that it is not just a state of Christians that the Pope or the Church wants to build, but a state of Catholics, and then a state of Protestants that those who are left out seek to build. So once they create a state of Catholics, the non-Catholics are a minority. Initially, of course, these are Muslims and Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. Either they are forcibly converted or they are forcibly expelled. So the immediate result, not the end result, the immediate result is ethnic cleansing. And then you have, once they've taken care of Muslims and Jews, then there's the question of Protestants. And everywhere you begin to get the spread of religious schisms between different Christian sects, but mainly between Catholics and Protestants. So this nation state creates a permanent majority in the Iberian Peninsula, a Catholic majority, and permanent minorities, Protestant minorities in the Iberian Peninsula. So the question is, what do these minorities do? Well, they seek to create their own state elsewhere. So everywhere you have this conflict between two groups of Christians, majority and minority, and the spread of religious wars, until we get a solution to it. And the solution to it is known as the Treaty of Westphalia, which comes about 2 centuries later. And that solution is based on a philosophical notion advanced by John Locke, the English philosopher. And Locke basically suggests that a kind of an agreement between the majority and the minority, an agreement based on a pact. And the pact would be that the minority would agree to live under the rule of the majority, under their sovereignty. So Catholics would be sovereign. And in return, this majority, the Catholics, would agree to recognize the rights of minorities. The rights, but without the minorities playing any power, any role in the sovereignty, in the exercise of power in the state. And this is what Locke called tolerance. So long as the minority's allegiance is exclusively to the Catholic state, so long as it, so long as it doesn't, Locke proposes in England, so it's reverse. The state is Protestant. And Locke is basically saying that the minority, the Catholic minority, should not pay homage to the Pope. It should just obey the laws of the Protestant state.
So bringing this analysis to the contemporary period, I guess, one of the reasons why you're seeing a lot of conflicts and wars in, say, in Africa and in the Middle East, and not, say, in Europe, is because the nation-state building and the genocide that's required and the ethnic cleansing that's required in the nation-state building in Europe has already taken place, and Europe has undergone that transformation through the ethnic cleansing, and that issue has been settled. But in other parts of the world, the underlying forces that push towards war in the creation of a nation state has not been settled. And what we're seeing in Africa, and definitely what we're seeing now, what we're seeing in the Middle East, and especially in historic Palestine and Israel, is this continuation of the nation state building project in a region where there are natural minorities, and this issue has not been solved in a way it was solved in Europe prior to Westphalia, where more than half the population in Germany were basically genocided and killed in the nation state building projects. Would that be a fair analysis of the scenario as we are seeing in Palestine?
I would say we go step by step. That's a huge sweep, which may be difficult to take on in one fell sweep. But let's go to Palestine. When the state of Israel is established, the Zionists want a Jewish nation state, but they want a liberal Jewish nation state. They want a Lockean style nation state. They want a nation state where sovereignty will be exclusively Jewish, but they will acknowledge rights of Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, not Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel. So the Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel are governed under military law. Palestinians ultimately in the West Bank, in Gaza, etc., these are under military law. But the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, about 20% now, they can vote. They can even run for elections, but they do not participate in power. So that's the arrangement under which the state of Israel reproduces itself. But then it changes. It doesn't have a written constitution, but its basic laws. It changes its basic laws so that Israel becomes an exclusively Jewish state where minorities do not have the rights in a liberal nation state. Israel transits from being a liberal to an illiberal nation state. So that's the big shift that happens. And once that shift happens, the ground is clear for ethnic cleansing. Once that shift happens, the settlers get a nudge, and they I mean, there's no stopping them. There is basically a state recognition that Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, is more than just what is covered by the state of Israel. And the settlers have the right to move in all directions, from the river to the sea, as the Likud party platform said. So that's where we are at now. We are in this phase of active ethnic cleansing, shading into genocide, because that ethnic cleansing has been opposed, and the opposition to it had been intermittent, and the Israeli response had been intermittently what they call mowing the lawn, every 2-3 years, killing a number of Palestinians in Gaza, and making things right, restoring peace. It's also been an Israeli effort to sort of follow some classic colonial strategies, which is summed up in the Roman adage, divide and rule, which the British adopted, and basically to ensure that a single Palestinian authority does not coalesce. So playing upon the division between Fatah and Hamas. And ironically, Israel considered Hamas the weaker side, and therefore decided to accede internal governance to Hamas, to accede foreign assistance coming from outside, so it would make sure that Israel doesn't have to pay the cost of its own colony, so that was. And then, of course, suddenly to wake up and find that what it had reasoned and thought was a wise and efficient strategy of control had turned out to be the opposite.
You mentioned in one of your interviews, I heard you mention the need to de-Zionize Israel. What do you mean by that? I mean, if we take the assumption, as you mentioned in your previous answer, that there's a difference between the liberal Zionism and the Zionism as we are seeing now, which is, which advocates for ethnic cleansing, advocates for genocide. Not advocates for genocide, but genocide becomes almost a necessity. Apartheid becomes almost inevitable in this version of Zionism. So when you say de-Zionization, do you mean a return to a different form of Zionism? Is that even possible? Can you have a liberal Zionist project that does not require the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their historic land. So what do you mean by de-Zionization as a prelude to settlement and peace in Palestine?
So religion exists in civil society, okay, everywhere. Hinduism exists in India. Islam exists in Pakistan, Bangladesh. Buddhism exists in Sri Lanka. Christianity exists throughout Europe. So to de-Zionize the state, to make a clear distinction between the state and religion, is not to remove religion from society. It is to remove religion from the state. To de-Zionize the state is to ensure that the state does not portray itself as a state of one part of society, even if that part is the majority, right? That it acknowledges diversities within society. And the question of majority and minority is not taken as a permanent question, but it is a question which is settled at every election in a democratic contest, where the presumption is that the majority can change. And the minority is not permanently a minority. It can hope to become a majority one day. And the assumption, therefore, is that majorities and minorities in the political sphere do not have to be defined by their religion. They would be defined by their politics, by their political allegiance, and by the program that they follow. So this separation of state and society is key to de-Zionize the state. Zionism can exist in society. Israel can be a homeland for Jews, but that doesn't mean that it has to be a state of the Jews. The two things are different. Okay.
Yeah, so it goes back to the 2018 nation-state law, where Israel claims that it is a nation-state for Jews only, and of course many other laws where it claims that it's the nation-state of Jews across the world, which by necessity means that a Jew in London has more rights than a Palestinian in Israel or Palestinian in Palestine. So these are the laws which you're alluding to. I'll have a final question on how we can have a different paradigm, a different way of looking at this. So there can be an end to occupation, an end to apartheid. But before we do that, I wanted to get your thoughts on the difference between immigrants and settlers. I mean, you've done a lot of work on that. Can you elaborate on that distinction between immigrants and settlers? Particularly the difference between, say, the Zionist settlers and Muslims who have settled in Europe. Because I ask this because one of the things that's becoming increasingly common is that this is from the Israeli side and the pro-Zionist side, is that they say, you know, what the Jews did in Palestine is no different to what the Muslims are doing in Europe. Muslims are coming here as immigrants, they are settling here, and they are becoming part of the fabric of Europe. Likewise, the early Jewish Zionist settlers went in there into Palestine as immigrants. They settled there as immigrants. They became part of the fabric of the society. Is that true? I mean, is there a distinction? Should we see a distinction between the way the early Zionists went in and how Muslims came to Europe, for example?
Well, in a strict sense, it is not true. First of all, Jews have been in the land of Palestine for a long period. Not even as immigrants or settlers, but as part of the natives of Palestine. They've been there. Then Jews began to come to Palestine as immigrants seeking a homeland. They began to come as anti-Semitism rose in Europe, and they wanted to get away from this persecution. So they came to Palestine individually. Then there was an organized immigration in the 20th century. There were three different phases of organization. They are known as aliyahs, three aliyahs. Aliyah means ascension, moving up. So the first aliyah is an organized immigration project. But the immigration project didn't really work because its backers had an object more than just immigration of individual Jews or Jewish families. They wanted to create a Jewish state. And they saw that the Jews who immigrated just melted into Palestinian society. They were just scattered, different, leading their own lives. And this changed the nature of immigration. The second and the third aliyah were organized projects, not just for Jewish immigration, but projects to create a Jewish state. So now, if they bought land, no Palestinian would be allowed to be settled on that land. Only Jewish settlement. If they created a cooperative, no Palestinian would be allowed to join that cooperative. If they created a labor union, the Histradut, no Palestinian would be allowed to join it. Only Jewish labor could join it. So the principle of exclusion was inserted right from the beginning of the second aliyah, because now Zionists took control of Jewish immigration. It moved from bringing Jews in as immigrants to bringing settlers. The difference is settlers have a political project. They have a state project. They don't just want to come in like Muslims going into Europe. Muslims going into Europe want rights of ordinary citizens. They want to be able to have a job, to get a place of living, to get their children to school, to practice their religion, etc., etc. They don't have a project for building an Islamic state. This is not the Islamic jihad. This is a different, it's a non-political project. It is the same project that Jewish immigrants had at the beginning of 20th century in Palestine. But with the beginning of the Zionist movement, the project changed. Now, this project led to a big schism, divide inside the Jewish community. There were those who supported Zionists and those who opposed Zionists. So some of the most well-known Jews, like Albert Einstein, like Sigmund Freud, like Hannah Arendt, they opposed Zionists. When asked to sign letters of support for the Zionist movement in the 1940s, they refused. And they said, this will lead to a disaster. So the first big split was inside Judaism itself. So this is, I mean, it's very important to realize that, one, today, more and more Jews are beginning to become skeptical of the settler project. More and more Jews realize they are safer in America than they are in Israel. They realize that homeland is not the same thing as state. You can have a homeland in Israel, you can have a homeland in America, you can have a homeland in England, right? But you can't have a state everywhere. But beyond that, you can have a homeland in Palestine, but that doesn't stop others from having a homeland there. Look, immigration is a human story. We're told that humanity originated in one place. The disagreement is on where it originated from. Was it in East Africa? Was it in Asia, East Asia? But everybody's agreed it originated in one place, then it migrated. Migration is a human story, right? Creation of settler states is not a human story. It's a breach in that story.
That's right. I mean, we can, as Muslims, UK be your homeland, US can be your homeland. The reason I asked that question partly is because you see this effort now to cast Muslim presence in Europe as being political, as though Muslims are here as foot soldiers for the Muslim Brotherhood. So there's this whole wild imagination of conspiracy that Muslims, when they engage in politics, they are playing the game of trying to undermine the state. And I find that's really, really disingenuous, partly because, that's not true. The level of migration of Muslims in Europe is nothing compared to the level of influx of Jews into Palestine from before the Second World War and up till the creation of the State of Israel. It's a huge difference. But yeah, let's end on a question returning to the issues you raised earlier about different ways of being, different ways of existing as communities, as civil societies in the world. I think that's probably a paradigm of a solution. But the problem, we are living in a world where everything is largely defined by the nation state paradigm. It's very difficult to escape that paradigm. So the question, this is of course more pressing for Palestine than anywhere else, what steps can be taken to move away from this paradigm, nation state? Every nation has to have their own state and defend that with arms, with nuclear, weapons if need be. So what modes of belonging and governance should we be advocating so that we don't have in Palestine one group insisting on a nation state to be imposed upon what was historically a pluralistic, society?
Look, the answer to this can be both relatively simple and very complicated. Relatively simple in the sense that the countries of Europe and America, where Europeans migrated and set up a settler state, have suffered the consequences of holding on to a nation state model. And it has forced them to relinquish that model to some extent or another. The model has been relinquished the most in the US. And it was relinquished after the Civil War. Because in the Civil War, during the Civil War, there was a confederacy in the US. And the confederacy was understood as a union of different nation states. Americans thought of having brought the European model to America. Each group had brought its own nation state. And citizenship in that confederacy was citizenship of a state, not of the American Confederacy. There was no such thing as a citizenship of the US Confederacy. If you were a citizen of Georgia, you didn't automatically become a citizen of another place. You had to apply for it. After the Civil War, Lincoln came up with an ingenious solution. in his Gettysburg speech, where he basically says that we are going to be born again. We are going to change the nature of citizenship from descent to a new principle, and that new principle is residence. So every person born in the US will be a citizen of the US, not of the estate in the Union. And whether you become a citizen of the US or not will depend on where you live, your residence, not your descent, not your birth. So this is a dramatic, because it meant that a person born in Alabama could move to California, and the next day that person would have the same rights as a Californian would, right? And this change, of course, took place over the question of African Americans, African slaves in the US, right? Because it is the different states of the Union, the southern states in particular, which claimed to decide the political status of African slaves. And now the federal government, no longer a confederacy, but a federation, said, no, you don't decide. We decide. If they live here, they are citizens. 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment. Right? So if you introduce that principle everywhere else, well, that would undercut basic premises of the nation state. Right? Now, of course, it hasn't been undercut completely in the US, because from there they went to the notion of a white, and from white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and then from that to Anglo-Saxon Protestant Jewish, and now they would like to make it Abrahamic.
Yeah, we see that.
Bring
So
in the Muslims, but leave out some others. Anyway, it's an ongoing struggle. It's not, but the principle has been conceded.
yeah, and I guess the quest or the challenge is to apply that principle in Palestine. If you were to apply that principle, then you would have some form of one state scenario where you have various nations, Jews, Christians, Muslims, Armenians, and all the other various nations that are indigenous to that territory would see Palestine, or whatever you want to call it, Palestine in our case, a home of many different nations within that state.
You
That's what I'm saying.
realize that it would also rule out words like indigenous from the political vocabulary.
That's true. And it's important to, yeah, that's
It
true.
would rule out a distinction between immigrant and native. So in the US,
So why is that important? Just I know it's important, but I just want to hear your explanation. Why is that so important to rule out terms like indigenous, natives? Because they're very contested terms, aren't they?
well, if you look at American politics today, and the politics around immigration, Trump, the Republican Party, many Democrats also, they do not want to think of immigrants as having the same status as those who came before. So the first native party was organized in the 19th century. It's just opposed to immigration, or immigration which leads to equal rights. So that's been it's an internal issue within the US, and it continues.
Yeah, it's been fascinating talking to you, Professor Mamdani. We have run out of time, and I really enjoyed my conversation with you. And I'm sure our viewers and listeners, however they see this will be available on podcasts and also on our YouTube channel. So I'm sure they'll be delighted to hear your thoughts on that. So thank you, and thank you whoever's tuned in and listening. Thank you for listening to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Naseem Ahmed. It's been a pleasure talking to you.